And perhaps most chilling, how could frail wood and fabric aircraft survive the tempest of anti-aircraft fire that a well-defended harbor could throw up? If you want a machine that seems to answer none of those questions, look at the Swordfish. Fairey's design dated from the early 1930s, a 3-bay biplane with fixed undercarriage, a top wing that seemed to belong on a barn rather than a carrier deck. It had a folding wing, an observer's cockpit with room for a radio operator, and a torpedo in a belly rack. It was slow, lumbering, unstable in a stiff wind, and vulnerable to fighters. The pilots called it the string bag, not only because of its ability to carry everything from torpedoes to bombs and depth charges, but because it looked like any number of pre-war utility aircraft bundled together. Yet those same qualities that made the Swordfish obsolete in some eyes made it remarkably suited to certain tasks. Its low wing loading meant it could fly slowly without stalling, which is critical if you need to drop a torpedo that must hit the water at a shallow angle and a sensible speed. The fabric and wood airframe was surprisingly forgiving at low altitude. Slower speed gave crews more time to judge wind and target. From the cramped deck of Illustrious, it could lift with a heavy load, a torpedo, extra fuel for the long run, flares for target illumination, and still get airborne. There was a poetry in that conclusion. A plane that should have been retired became the right tool because of what it lacked in speed. It compensated in steadiness. The Swordfish's limitations were not illusions to the men who flew them. Their diaries and logbooks are candid about fear and the cold. John Neal, an observer who later wrote about his experience, summed a moment in 2 short lines that stuck with many historians. "We flew low, lower than we ever imagined. The sea was a black sheet, and the guns made it a sieve." That spare admission carries both the technical demand of the raid and the human sensory cost. The cold cutting through gloves, the spray in the face, the constant taste of oil and metal. How did the British hope to bridge the gap between such fragile aircraft and armored capital ships? Innovation in planning and an uncompromising rehearsal of basic navigation. Reconnaissance played a crucial part. Photographs of Taranta's harbor taken from distance and pieced together told planners where the mole, the anchorages, and the likely belts of defenses lay. Intelligence showed that many of the Italian battleships were anchored close to shore to allow for nearby repair facilities. But this also meant they were concentrated targets if a strike could reach them. Navigation would be the hinge on which the raid turned. There were no GPS dots or electronic beacons to follow. Pilots and observers had to rely on dead reckoning, compass headings, maps, and a tiny cluster of tools that now looked domestic. A silk escape map folded inside a cigarette case, a basic drift log, a handheld compass, and an air log. Silk maps were preferred precisely because they folded small, did not tear in dampness, and could be stuffed into a pocket without crinkling like paper. These were the equivalent of a lifeline. They also gave a picture of the route with landmarks annotated for night conditions, how to find a coastline by the shape of a promontory, which towns threw the brightest lights, how to avoid being fooled by deceptive shoreline lamps. HMS Illustrious herself was a new generation carrier, armored to survive a hit, her hangar deck protected more robustly than previous carriers. That protective design meant she could carry out offensive operations in contested waters where a less armored carrier might have been too vulnerable. Her air wing, however, was not large. Commanders had to accept that any operation would rely on accuracy and daring as much as numbers. The Admiralty approved a plan that was audacious and methodical. Night attacks had been tried in various forms earlier in the war, but not in the concentrated way required to strike multiple capital ships at anchor. The idea was to use 2 waves. The first wave's job would be to illuminate, flares dropped by aircraft to silhouette targets and draw the defender's attention, while the second, following on that light, would make the torpedo runs. That sequence risked alerting the defenders. Timing and coordination had to be near perfect. There was also a question of torpedo modification. Standard torpedo settings were designed for open sea drops where the escape depth and water conditions differed. Torpedoes might dig into shallow water or run too deep and strike the seabed, breaking apart. Engineers and torpedo experts worked on adjusting the detonators and the buoyancy so that torpedoes would run reliably in a harbor environment. The human element, the crews, were both the unknown and the most critical variable. Many of the flyers were young, their training hurried by necessity. Yet they had naval discipline and the steady nerves that come from months at sea, catapulting into turbulence and landing on pitching decks. The observers, tireless in using sextants and dead reckoning tables, accepted that a single mistake in navigation could mean flying into neutral waters, enemy territory, or the sea. Many crews were paired specifically for the operation. Men like Sub-Lieutenant Spike Spark, known as the pilot of L4C Clio, would later be cited in reports for steadiness under fire. The mission demanded not just technical skill, but a level of trust between pilot and observer typically reserved for decades of shared service. There were moments of pragmatic improvisation that reveal the operation's character.
In rehearsals, crews practiced low-altitude approaches over friendly waters, learning to judge the height at which a torpedo would enter cleanly. They measured the height by sight, by the angle of the bow wave, and by the feel of the aircraft. Nothing electronic, everything sensory. Engineers adjusted torpedo settings based on small-scale trials. Radio silence protocols were written and rewritten to minimize the risk of interception. The plan was as much about restraint, what not to do, as it was about action. On Illustrious, the night before the attack, there was a quiet that felt too deep to be simple. Men stowed silk maps in breast pockets and fastened flares. The hangar hummed with mechanical checks. Commanders huddled over charts, fingers tracing the route across a black sea. There was also a small, private courage, a pilot checking the angle of his trim tabs, an observer tightening a glove, a wireless operator polishing contacts to ensure a signal would not fail. These modest rituals, the trimming, the packing, the double-checking, were the human scaffolding of the entire enterprise. When the fleet left its assembly area, the sea was a black field, the stars a thin scatter above. The carrier's decks bristled with aircraft secured for launch short of ideal distances by the constraints of the ship. Each swordfish took off in turn, lumbering into a pale cone of oil-slicked air, their propellers lighting the night with arc-like blades. They gathered into tiny scattered constellations over the waves, then formed lines that would take them east toward Toronto. As they flew, crews faced the immediate physical penalties of their machine. The swordfish's open cockpit made the cold an ever-present adversary. Breath steamed in front of a pilot's face, fingers numbed on the controls. The constant roar of engine and the slap of wind against canvas made conversation rare. Shorthand calls and prearranged signals governed actions. Observers kept angled compasses and drift tables, noting minute corrections. The night swallowed landmarks. When a light flashed from shore, crews checked bearings and corrected. Minute errors could accumulate over the long run. Those who had flown longer distances at night knew the trick. Trust the instruments enough to correct. Trust the eyes enough to recognize when a beacon or a promontory refused to match a chart. The first wave's job when it reached Toronto was to drop flares that would, for a brief moment, paint the harbor in unambiguous light. They had to do this without giving away too much of their approach, and crucially, without blinding the torpedo bombers that would follow. The flare droppers faced the paradox of their role. They illuminated the targets but also signaled to the defenders that something was imminent. The timing, therefore, was brutal in its simplicity. Drop flares at exactly the right latitude and longitude and get out of the way for the second wave. Accounts of the actual approach are vivid in their austerity. John Neal's diary captures it in a sentence that reads on the page like a photograph. The flares were like falling moons. The guns began like a hive disturbed. Not poetic language, just the bluntness of a man reporting what he saw and heard. It is the kind of line that keeps historians grounded. Not a romance, but a record. The flares did their work, though not without cost. Searchlights swung like metronomes, panting columns of air and spotlighting targets. Anti-aircraft batteries, disciplined and well-drilled, opened up. Anti-aircraft fire was the predictable terror of the raid. The harbor's emplacements included heavier guns and lighter pom-poms, the latter designed to spread a curtain of small, fast projectiles where fast-moving planes might fly. The swordfish were slow and presented tempting targets. Yet their low altitude made some anti-aircraft pieces less effective at the precise moments of torpedo release, and it took time for heavier batteries to adjust fire for such shallow approaches. Some of the Italian defensive doctrine assumed an attack from higher altitude or from faster aircraft. The swordfish exploited that doctrinal blind spot. But the defenders were not naive. The first wave experienced concentrated barrages and tracer that arced towards their wings. It is important to stress that the attack was not a clean cinematic success. It was bloody, confused, and dependent on moments of luck and quick thinking. Several swordfish were damaged or shot down in approaches and returns. Reports from the time are judicious in cataloging loss and damage without editorial flourish. Those losses were real and are part of the moral ledger of the operation. Between the two waves, commanders on Illustrious watched tense screens and received signals filtered through relay and radio. The Admiralty would later receive a terse message, most satisfactory. That phrase, at once vague and celebratory, would become a small codified way to record that the outcome had met command expectations. Yet at the time, that satisfaction was tentative. Only reconnaissance could confirm what had actually been done. When the second wave arrived, the real test began. Torpedo drops were an art as much as a science. A torpedo would only run correctly if released at the right height, typically around 12 to 20 feet above the water, and at the right speed and angle. If dropped too high, it could slam into the sea and break. Too slow or at a poor angle, it might not stabilize and would run unpredictably. The Swordfish's slow speed helped here. It allowed pilots a window in which to stabilize and judge release. But that advantage came with the constant risk that clustering anti-aircraft fire or a desperate defensive maneuver could jolt a plane at the critical moment.
You can imagine, in sequence, a swordfish descending until the sea's blackness nearly fills the windshield, the pilot looking up briefly to spot the ship's profile, then down to judge the height. The torpedo, strapped beneath, waits like an animal in a stall. There's a mechanical click as the release is made, a lurch as the torpedo drops clear, and then the anxious 100 seconds as the weapon runs to the target. Observers watched for the telltale wake, pilots prepared an evasive turn. In some cases, torpedoes found their mark with devastating effect. In others, they ran too deep or struck shallows and failed. It is worth pausing to consider what a single torpedo hit meant to a modern battleship. Even a shallow harbor could not entirely protect a ship from flooding or magazine damage. A hit below the waterline could cause the ship to list and sink in harbor, blocking berths and reducing the fleet's operational capacity. Battleships are resilient, yes, but they are not invulnerable when attacked at anchor, especially when multiple vessels face coordinated strikes. As the second wave made its runs, some torpedoes found targets. The most consequential blows fell on larger units clustered in Toronto's anchorage. Reports later cataloged damage to several capital ships, including the battleship Comte de Cavour, which took severe damage, and damage or impairment to the Littorio-class vessels present. These ships would be out of action for periods that mattered to Mediterranean operations. The immediate tactical consequence was simple. Ships that could have maybe sortied and challenged convoys were not available for months while they underwent repairs. Strategically, this changed calculations about where and how the Royal Navy could press its advantage. Yet even as hits were confirmed, the raid remained messy. Not every torpedo worked as intended. Not every plane returned. The human toll could have been higher. For every instance of a torpedo running true, there were near misses, failed detonations, and planes limping home with holes in their wings. There are reports of crews having to ditch near friendly ships or being rescued from the sea. There are accounts of heroic seamanship on the part of destroyers and other small craft that pulled downed airmen from cold water. At the end of that long night, when the fleet withdrew and reconnaissance photographs were taken at first light, the picture was undeniable. Toronto's harbor bore the marks of violence. Photographs showed listing hulls and fragments of superstructure damaged by fire and blast. The Admiralty's assessment cataloged the results with meticulous care. The phrase "most satisfactory" would join the archive as a bureaucratic shorthand for an operation that indeed achieved its tactical aims. But what did Toronto mean beyond that night? Historians are cautious, as they should be, about drawing straight lines through complex causation.
It is tempting to say Toronto changed everything, and in some ways it did. It demonstrated in stark clarity that carrier aviation could strike a well-defended fleet at anchor and do substantial damage. That proof had doctrinal effects. Navies around the world took notice, and naval planners could no longer assume that a well-anchored fleet was entirely safe. Some later planners, including those in other navies, would study Toronto when conceiving their own strike plans. To say Toronto alone caused later events like the attack on Pearl Harbor would be simplistic. To say it influenced thought and offered a tactical precedent is accurate and supported by contemporary references and memoirs. Strategic influence is always a matter of degree and context. For the men who flew, Toronto remained first and foremost a human experience, cold, dangerous, and accomplished with a mixture of improvisation and sheer nerve. When you read their short diary entries and see the folded silk maps and the soot-streaked logbooks, you don't get a clean narrative of triumph. You get the texture of a night in which measured skill and luck blended to produce an outcome with disproportionate consequences. As dawn broke over Illustrious and the surviving Swordfish made their way back to deck, the crews were exhausted. The carrier's arrestor wires bit into the aircraft's undercarriage with the familiar jolt and grit of deck landings. Men who had hours earlier flown over a harbor full of shooting now clambered down from wings and into the warmth of the carrier's mess, where a cup of tea tasted like the last thing standing between them and collapse. There were awards later and mentions in dispatches, but there were also quiet recollections and long silences in men's letters home. If you stand beside the swordfish today at the museum, you can touch the silk escape map, smell the oil, run a finger along the fabric skin, and imagine the slackening and tightening as it took the waves. The artifacts are small anchors back to an enormous night. They give us a material intimacy with decisions that otherwise seem abstractly strategic. Trim tabs adjusted, flares primed, a torpedo's gyroscope tested before being let go. We could, at this point, narrate the rest of the saga, how the Admiralty digested the photographs, how repair yards labored on twisted plates, how the longer-term balance in the Mediterranean shifted. But there's still a moment we haven't yet described fully, the moment when the second wave, carrying the torpedoes that would strike the harbor, crossed the coastline and began their runs. It is a precise fragment of time, dense with technical risk and human tension. The pilots, with their veins full of caffeine and cold, had to make two things happen almost simultaneously: judge the ship by silhouette and time the drop with the precision of a surgeon.
Anti-aircraft bursts carved the sky, searchlights whipped the darkness, and somewhere below, the engines of the captains of the fleet were burning their fuel to keep their ships on station. On one of the planes, L4C Clio, Spike Spark felt the aircraft shudder as flak went wide, a tiny starburst too close. The observer, eyes glued to the chart, called a correction to heading by tapping the pilot's shoulder. The torpedo was armed, primed to go. The sea ahead was a black canvas speckled with harbor lights and the vertical needles of searchlights. Then, in a practiced motion, the plane dipped. The drop was made. What happened in the seconds that followed, on other runs, under other flares, is still a matter of acute detail. Torpedoes ran true to their targets. Some plunged into the hulls with explosive efficacy. Others struck the shallow seabed and failed. But for a moment, that breath after a torpedo left a plane, everything depended on accurate gunnery, the quirks of night, and the stubborn physics of weaponry in water. The story is not over. When the smoke thinned and the first pale light of dawn touched the western horizon, reconnaissance aircraft and photo reconnaissance from the fleet began to stitch together the night's truth. From the air, Toronto was a landscape transformed, a harbor no longer pristine, but scarred with list and water-black wounds. Photographs showed one battleship badly down by the stern, another holed and settling, a dark stain of oil leaking into still water. The damage was concrete, not theory. The strike had worked where many had feared it might fail. The most severely affected capital ship was the Comte de Cavour. She had taken blows that left her down by the stern, partially submerged at her anchorage. Salvage and repair would be long and costly. Other heavy units present in the harbor also showed signs of damage or impairment. At least one Littorio-class vessel, the modern, powerful ships that personified Italian naval strength, was put out of action or rendered unready for immediate operations. Harbors full of concrete piers and repair yards hummed into frantic activity. The Royal Navy's immediate operational advantage was stark. Ships that might otherwise have challenged convoys or contested sea control were suddenly unavailable for months. The Admiralty's dispatches preserved the peculiar austerity of naval bureaucracy in the face of extraordinary daring. A terse signal soon crossed the wire. Most satisfactory. It is an uneuphoric phrase, but it captured the essential truth. The operation had achieved its principal objective. For the men who had flown those slow, stubborn biplanes, for the sailors who had trimmed arrestor wires and tended boilers through the night, most satisfactory was a distillation of relief, exhaustion, and for some, grief. It is worth pausing on the nuances of success. Toronto was not a clean annihilation of the Italian fleet. Not every torpedo found purchase.
Several swordfish were brought down by flak or return fire. Others limped home with shredded fabric and bent struts. There were rescues from small escort vessels and some fatal losses, the human costs recorded in terse service papers and family letters. Yet the operation's disproportionate tactical effect, knocking capital ships out of immediate reckoning, was what altered the chessboard of the Mediterranean. The immediate operational consequences were unmistakable. With several battleships sidelined, the Regia Marina's capacity to challenge British convoys was reduced. This relief for convoy operations and Malta's precarious lifelines was significant. Supplies could move with a little less dread of encountering a whole Italian battle fleet. For the Royal Navy, the raid bought time and space. For the Italian Navy, it imposed a period of repair and caution. That was the calculus of victory at sea, not only sinking a ship, but rendering it unable to influence operations when it counted. But historians rightly resist tidy causal chains. Toronto did not by itself rewrite every naval doctrine overnight, nor did it alone produce the conditions for future attacks elsewhere. What Toronto did do was deliver something rarer, empirical proof. It showed in photographed hulls and damaged decks that carrier-based torpedo aircraft could reach a defended harbor at night and inflict strategic damage. Navies around the world took note. Admirals who had once prized the battleship above all now had to plan around a different truth. Aircraft operating from carriers could strike at anchorages as effectively as they could at sea. That empirical proof made its way into professional reading rooms, naval staff colleges, and intelligence dossiers. Japanese naval planners, already attentive to the potential of carrier aviation, studied the photographs and the reports. In the months and years that followed, Toronto appears among the documents the Japanese officers reviewed when thinking about a surprise carrier-launched strike. But influence is not causation. Historians have debated how much Toronto shaped the Japanese plan for Pearl Harbor. The archive shows interest and study, not a single deterministic line from one night in the Mediterranean to a dawn over Oahu. Toronto was a model, an argument with evidence. It was one of several precedents that shaped conceptual thinking about the reach of naval air power. The raid also forced a reconsideration of harbor defense and ship vulnerability. Planners who had assumed anchorages offering relative impunity now faced the reality of aerial torpedoes running under searchlights and through curtains of anti-aircraft fire. Naval architects, engineers, and harbor commanders took lessons forward about anti-torpedo booms, about improved light and medium anti-aircraft coordination, about the necessity for layered air defense even at anchor.
The British themselves learned modifications to torpedo release procedures, to aircraft tactics, and to carrier training followed. The Swordfish's success was not merely about luck. It accelerated doctrinal learning on both sides of the conflict. There is a tendency in military history to fixate on machines and misses the human scale. Toronto's material record, the silk maps folded damp in pockets, the soot-streaked logbooks, the tiny navigational compasses rubbed smooth by fingers, tells the more intimate story. John Neal's lines keep returning in my mind. We flew low, lower than we ever imagined. The sea was a black sheet, and the guns made it a sieve. That sentence is a small monument to the immediate sensory truth of the night, the cold that bit through clothing, the metallic taste of engine rail in the mouth, the staccato percussion of anti-aircraft bursts overhead. Other names surface in the official records and in private papers. Spike Spark at the controls of L4C Clio, steady under fire. Alfie Sutton, an observer in the second wave who noted in a brief entry how the flares turned the sea into paper. Tiffy Torrance Stetz, who later became associated with several Fleet Air Arm anecdotes of courage. I avoid inventing private conversations. The archives will not sustain them. But these men's service records, mentions in dispatches, and surviving diaries make their presence undeniable. Their bravery was ordinary in the sense that it was disciplined, repetitive courage, the long hours on deck, the drills, the 1,000 small technical checks repeated until they were muscle memory. There were also the quieter stories of seamanship after the attack. Destroyers and smaller craft, the unsung partners of carrier operations, went to the aid of downed airmen, dragging wet flyers from dark water into the heat of a boiler room. Ship surgeons tended to wounds in cramped below-deck surgery spaces. Mess queues formed again as men sought the consolation of scalded tea. These minor acts of compassion and professional care are part of the operation's moral ledger as much as the official citations. The artifacts from that night retain an intense power. Looking at a silk map in the museum, you can see pencil marks indicating course corrections and shore identifications, the small human gestures that joined to make an audacious plan succeed. A torpedo checklist, with boxes ticked and initials in a cramped hand, reminds us that large historical events hang on tiny technical promises, that a gyroscope would endure a drop, that the detonator would arm at the right moment, that the microphone connection for a single radio call would not fail the communication chain. Those items do not romanticize. They make the event tangible and therefore morally comprehensible.
When you step into a preserved swordfish today, you also encounter the paradox that shaped the whole enterprise. The same machine that appears, at first glance, unsuited to modern war, proved by its very slowness and steadiness to be ideal for a nocturnal torpedo attack. I have flown in a restored swordfish. The experience is not theatrical nostalgia, it is anatomy. The cockpit is an open mouth to the heavens. The wind presses, the vibration becomes part of the spine, the smell of castor oil and fuel sits in the sinuses. You feel the tape of the slipstream against your cheeks and the constant small corrections of the stick to keep the world level. At low altitude above water, the surface seems to come astonishingly close. Everything becomes a matter of seconds and inches. Flying in that plane, not to reenact, but to understand, is a way of reconnecting with the practical world those men inhabited. Navigation becomes sensual, the curve of a coastline, the intensity of a town's lights, the first white of a lighthouse on the horizon. The silk map that once tucked into a breast pocket is now a relic handled with care by curators, and yet it still suggests the practical improvisation that underpinned the raid, how men used what they had, a compass, a watch, a folded piece of silk, to turn audacity into action. Toronto also reverberates in more abstract conversations about technology and suitability. The Swordfish reminds us that technological modernity is not a simple ladder of progress. A piece of equipment dismissed by some as obsolete can, in certain contexts, be precisely the right tool. The Swordfish's low stall speed, ability to carry heavy loads from short decks, and forgiving handling at low altitude converted apparent weakness into tactical advantage. That is an enduring lesson for military planners. Match capability to mission and accept the paradox that older technology sometimes wins when conditions favor its idiosyncrasies. In the longer sweep of the Mediterranean campaign, Toronto was a pivotal episode among many. It did not single-handedly decide theaters, but it reshaped conversations. It emboldened some British commanders to press naval air power more aggressively. It forced Italian commanders to reconsider anchorage safety and fleet disposition. It provided others, beyond the European theater, with a case study in the possibility of surprise under cloak of night. The personal epilogues are simple and real. Men returned to families, some to medals, others to quiet lives that did not speak often of the night. Files of letters show how survivors described the experience with a mixture of pride and a desire to leave the violent memory behind. Where there were losses, families received official notices. Where there were survivors, reunions were sometimes awkward with the sense that something important had been taken out of them, a kind of moral residue that does not map easily onto medals or dispatches.
Back at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, I find my hand on the linen skin of a swordfish and try to reconcile two images: the machine's fragile materiality and the enormous strategic effect it helped produce. The fabric shivers in an imagined wind. My fingers follow a seam, and I think of the hands that once stitched mission patches, tightened control cables, and smudged grease from instruments in the dim glow of a carrier's hangar. Those hands belonged to men who made judgment calls with lives and the balance of sea lanes at stake. The artifacts do not elevate their deeds into myth. Rather, they humanize the costs and the ordinary steel of the people who executed a remarkable plan. If there is a single image that should hold in the memory after Taranto, it is not the photograph of a smoking ship alone, nor a dramatic rewrite of doctrine. It is the narrow, cold moment when a pilot or observer judged height by eye, released a torpedo, and turned away into searchlights and tracer. That split second of decision contained probability and consequence. It was where training, luck, and nerve met. The rest, the photographing of damage at dawn, the repair yard's long weeks of work, the staff conversations in distant rooms, followed from that precise action. And yet there is another, quieter consequence. Taranto reminded naval professionals that war is always as much about adapting to constraints as it is about harnessing brute material power. The Fleet Air Arm did not possess an armada of modern monoplane torpedo bombers. It had what it had: grit, skill, and a plane whose peculiarities suited a particular plan. That adaptive creativity is part of the operational art, and Taranto offers a case study of innovation under pressure. As I walked away from the Swordfish that day, the museum curator handed me a photocopy of a page from a logbook with a single notational line: secured, flares expended, returned. It is prosaic, almost bureaucratic, but the prosaic is often the honest record, the small marks of procedure that accumulate into history. They are reminders that great moments are composed of routine acts repeated under extraordinary conditions. If you want to go deeper into this night and the machines that made it possible, the Fleet Air Arm Museum has further material and archives that illuminate both the technical and human stories. There are pages of signals, photos from reconnaissance sorties, and the silent silk maps folded as they were on that cold night. For anyone who wants to see the objects that carried the weight of a decision, that is where the materiality of Taranto waits. The larger lesson is a measured one. Taranto did not unmake the age of the battleship overnight, but it forced navies to accept that air power, especially carrier-based aviation, was a decisive factor in maritime strategy. What had been a doctrinal assumption became an operational reality. Ships at anchor could be reached, fleets would need to plan accordingly.
Admiralty rooms filled with new diagrams, and planners recalculated risk in light of photographs and the known physics of torpedoes and flight. Taranto accelerated conversations and, in practical ways, changed how maritime power was projected. Finally, we return to the human scale for a closing thought. History is often narrated as contests of machines and strategies, but the decisive ingredient is usually the people. Men who read maps by starlight, who trusted each other in creaking cockpits, who rode through flak and wind because they believed their actions mattered. Their choices multiplied into effects that far exceeded any single life. The swordfish sits in museums not to glorify war, but to remind us of the brittle materiality of conflict and of the ordinary courage that sometimes makes extraordinary outcomes possible. This battered-looking biplane, linen skin, wooden struts, steady under a load, helped rewrite part of how navies fought. It did so not because it was the most advanced machine, but because men matched capacity to mission, trusted small devices like silk maps and torpedo checklists, and were willing to close the distance under fire. In that compressed space between deck and target, between decision and release, history changed. If this episode resonates with you, subscribe for more deep dives into the machines and moments that reshaped how wars were fought. And if you want to explore the artifacts and archives yourself, the Fleet Air Arm Museum's collections are an indispensable starting point. Their websites and reference materials are linked in the description. Toronto remains, in the end, a study in contrast, apparent obsolescence transformed into decisive utility, fragile materials against iron hulks, human judgment at the scale of inches making strategic shifts measured in months. The image I carry away is simple: a swordfish skimming the Black Sea under a scatter of searchlights, its pilot leaning forward into wind and night, a small folded silk map in a pocket, and the hope that training and nerve might be enough. That small plane, and the people who flew in it, are the answer to the paradox: how something that looked like a relic helped bend the course of a campaign.